Welcome back, friends. In this lecture, we are going to continue operator precedence parsing operation. So, in the last lecture, we have discussed up to computation of leading and trailing. So, in this lecture, we are going to discuss about the computation of precedence parse table, how to construct the precedence table. So, there are some set of rules in order to construct the precedence table. So, before that, I will again mention the problem of this operator precedence parsing. So this is the grammar, set of grammar. E tends to E plus T or T tends to T star F or F tends to open parenthesis, E close parenthesis or ID. So now already we have computed the leading and trailing for this particular production rule. This is leading of E, leading of T and leading of F, and this is trailing of E, trailing of T and trailing of F. So the first rule is we have to set dollar less than A for all A in leading of S and set B greater than dollar for all B in trailing of S. Okay. So we know that already we have computed A at B for the leading of S and trailing of S. So where S is the start symbol. Okay. So where S is the start symbol. So so here we are mentioning about the E here, non-terminal E, because in our production rule, non-terminal E is the starting symbol. So we already identified leading of E and trailing of E. Okay. So dollar has to be mentioned on the left hand side, and the precedence relation less than will be mentioned like this. And A is nothing but the terminals, what are all the things present in leading of E. So leading of E contains plus, star, open parenthesis and ID. That should be mentioned like this. Plus, star, open parenthesis, ID. So this is for set dollar less than A for all A in leading of S. Now we will perform it again the same procedure, but the difference is we are going to compute trailing of start symbol. So set B greater than dollar for all B is B is the collection of terminals in trailing of S. So trailing of S means trailing of the start symbol E. So what is trailing of E? Plus star close parenthesis and ID. So that should be mentioned like this in the place of B plus star close parenthesis and ID. So and the greater than precedence relation will be mentioned like this for everything, and then the right hand side will be dollar. Okay, this is the first rule. Then second rule is if A tends to xy, where x and y are terminals, then set x equal to y. So unfortunately, in our production rule, there is no production rule in such a format. Both the both the components. So all the components in the right hand side should be terminal. So there is no such production rule in our there is no such production rule in our problem. Okay, there is only one production rule, that is E tends to T and T tends to F and F tends to ID. There is only single production rule in the right hand side. No two adjacent and terminals are there. Sorry, there are only one terminal in the right hand side for E tends to T and for T tends to F and for F tends to ID. Only one terminal is present in the right hand side. So there are no two terminals present in the right hand side as in the adjacent position. So there is no production rule, such production rule for this format. So go to rule 3. If A tends to X, B, Y, where X and Y are terminals, and B is a single non-terminal. So if in such a case, we have to mention that set X equal to Y. Okay. So we have a production rule in this format, that is F tends to open parenthesis E and close parenthesis. You see here. So open parenthesis is a terminal, close parenthesis is also terminal. In between these two terminals, we are having a non-terminal E. So it will be mentioned as so it can be mentioned as according to the format. So we have to set X equal to Y. So open parenthesis equal to close parenthesis. Equal to is the precedence relation here. Okay. So the next rule is if A tends to XB and if X is a terminal, Then for all A in leading of B, you have to set X less than A. So the meaning is, if we are having a production rule in this format, A tends to XB. Here X is a terminal. X is a terminal and B is a non-terminal. If we are having a production rule in this format, so then we have to identify the leading of B. We have to identify the leading of B. Leading of B will contain set of terminals. Okay, set of terminals. Those terminals are mentioned as A. Okay, so we have to mention A in the right hand side, and the precedence relation will be less than for X. Okay, X is a terminal. So what are all the production rule are present according to this format is? So you see here E tends to E plus T in this production rule. This E will be mentioned as A tends to, you leave this E, you see here plus is X and T, non-terminal T is B. So what is leading of B? Here leading of B is leading of T. So what is leading of T? Star, star, open parenthesis and ID. Okay, star, open parenthesis and ID, that should be in the right hand side. That is A. This is A, star, open parenthesis and ID is A, and the precedence relation is less than, what is X here? So here X is plus, that is mentioned here, plus, plus less than star, plus less than open parenthesis, plus less than ID. Okay, so this fourth rule will be set for this production rule. Okay, then what is the another production rule? T tends to T star F. So this can also be mentioned as A tends to XB. Here X is mentioned as star and B is mentioned as F. So now we have to identify leading of B, that is leading of F. So leading of F is open parenthesis and ID, that should be mentioned in the right hand side, open parenthesis and ID. Then the less than symbol, that is the precedence relation, less than, then X is the star. Okay, so X is the terminal, that is the star is the terminal here. Okay, so according to this rule, this production rule will applicable. This production rule is also applicable. Then what is the next production rule? F tends to open parenthesis, E close parenthesis. So this also can be mentioned with A tends to XB. Here first terminal open parenthesis mentioned as X and the second non-terminal mentioned as B. So we have to identify leading of B, that is leading of E. Leading of S is plus star, open parenthesis and ID. And what is X? That's a terminal. X is the open parenthesis here, that is mentioned in the left hand side. Okay. So now fourth rule has been completed and we have evaluated the fourth rule for all our production rule. Now the fifth rule is, if A tends to BX and if X is a terminal, then for all B in trailing of B. So now you see here the X is the terminal that is present in the right hand side. So we have seen in the computational of trailing itself, when the terminal comes at the right end, first portion in the right end, so that is trailing. So we have to identify trailing of B. So inside the trailing of B, we'll be having the collection of terminals that is mentioned as terminal B. Okay, so at that case, we have to set is set B greater than X. Set B greater than X. So again, take this production rule, E tends to E plus T. This production rule can be mentioned in the format of A tends to BX. So this E is the non-terminal B and plus is the terminal X. So what is so at this case, what we have to do? We have to identify trailing of B. Trailing of B is trailing of E. What is trailing of E? Plus star, close parenthesis and ID. What is the relationship we have to set? Greater than symbol. So greater than, and what is the terminal X? Plus is the terminal X here. Plus. Okay. Then next thing is T tends to T star F. T tends to T star F. So A tends to, so how we can mention this? T tends to T star F is, so here T tends to T star F, it can be mentioned with A tends to BX. So here's this first non-terminal T is mentioned as B and this second terminal star will be mentioned as X. So here we have to identify the trailing of B. Trailing of B is nothing but trailing of T. So trailing of T is not what we can mention. Trailing of T. What is trailing of T? Trailing of T is star close parenthesis and ID. Star close parenthesis and ID. The relationship, precedence relationship is greater than, and what is X? Star is the X. X star star star. It will be mentioned like this. And what is another production rule? F tends to open parenthesis E and close parenthesis. Here again it can be mentioned with A tends to this terminal E will be mentioned as B, and sorry, non-terminal E will be mentioned as B, and terminal close parenthesis will be mentioned as X. Okay. So now we have to identify leading of B, that is leading of, sorry, trailing of B, that is trailing of E. What is trailing of E? Trailing of E is plus star close parenthesis ID. You see here plus star close parenthesis and ID. The relationship is greater than. So greater than has been mentioned here. And what is X? Close parenthesis. So here it is mentioned as close parenthesis. So with the help of these points, now we have identified the precedence relationship for all our terminals, So with the help of these things, we can draw the precedence relation table like this. Mention all the terminals in the row format as well as in the column format. So plus star open parenthesis close parenthesis ID dollar plus star open parenthesis close parenthesis ID dollar. So now how we can write this is, so you see here, first thing we have identified for dollar less than plus. Mention it as dollar less than plus, dollar less than star, dollar less than open parenthesis, dollar less than ID. Okay, like that, what are all the relationship we have identified that should be mentioned in the entire precedence table. So after that, there will be some unfilled cells will be there. Those cells will be mentioned as error. So you see here, there is no entry for, we haven't identified the relationship for open parenthesis and dollar. You can check it in this computation. There will not be any computation for open, but there will not be any computation relationship for precedence relationship for open parenthesis and dollar, as well as for close parenthesis and open parenthesis, and ID and open parenthesis, ID and ID. So, okay, for these things we cannot compute the precedence relationship. So those things will be mentioned as error. Okay, so this is what the computation of precedence table. So in the next lecture, with the help of this precedence table, we will see how to parse the input string. Thank you.